Right, so thanks for all dialing in. Through some of the conversations on the OKR issue and other conversations, it sounded like it was a good idea to get all of us to chat together. So I've just put 2 questions in the agenda doc for today, which is to talk about the latest ideas per instance and what an OKR should include, but feel free to add anything else if there's other pieces of this that we need to discuss. But let's start with that and see where the conversation takes us.
Sorry, am I missing the link to the agenda doc?
Oh, sorry, I put it in the channel, but it's the
Right.
Scalability meetings one that usually gets used.
Cool. Nope. I'm missing it. Which channel? Sorry.
Just this normal Scalability channel.
Ah, right. Good.
Yeah.
Right, I'm with you now. Sorry.
Right. So I see at the moment we've got some notes on there on the plan per instance. We've got Redis cache and Redis persistent being possible candidates for cluster. Redis sidekick looking like sidekick zonal clusters are there. And then Redis rate limiting and Redis trace chunks being traditional Redis. Yes, I'm not exactly sure where to take the conversation.
I had a couple of things I wanted to talk about in that thing. So there's 2 streams to this that I think we're talking about, and they're kind of orthogonal. And I want to make sure that we understand that. And we've got this. One is running Redis in Kubernetes, which is about management, because we've got 5, we're soon going to have 6. We'll in a year we'll have 10. You know, there's going to be more. The other is Redis cluster for the ones that are cluster compatible and make sense to do. Those things, those 2 streams are independent. They're orthogonal. Yeah, we could do cluster on VMs. We could do cluster in Kubernetes. We could do, we're talking about them in the same conversation, in the same OKR, but they are 2 distinct decisions to make and work streams. And I want to make sure that we don't, that's where I was getting really tied up. We were talking about both things in the same conversation, and I was just, I couldn't get those words out. And I want to make sure that everyone understands that and that we are talking about the same thing at the same time. Does that make sense? Cool.
Yes, I think I had put the 2 together to try and generate some kind of ambitious OKR that is around this, but I do very much recognize that they're 2 quite different things. We're trying to find something that is challenging to attain with delivery's help to do so, but at the same time we need to choose something that makes sense to do. And that's where I think the conversation about Redis sidekick becomes interesting, because it's the one that seems to have the smallest headroom, but seems to be the one that is a fairly complicated thing to address.
Headroom on sidekick isn't bad at the moment. Persistent is much higher, so over 90%.
Okay.
Right, but persistent is also something where we're moving a bunch of stuff out.
True. Yeah, session's coming out soon. You're right. Yeah. True. Yeah, and in about 3 weeks' time, we'll know something completely different about what persistent looks like.
Yeah, exactly. I think. I mean, basically, yeah, we seem fine with cache. We're obviously fine with rate limiting. We're obviously fine with trace chunks. Currently, we're fine with sessions because we don't actually, do anything with it. I think there is interesting stuff we could do with the cache in particular, because that's kind of the easiest one to reason about, but I'm not sure if any of it's really worth doing now. But definitely if we could make the cache, you'd say use Redis cluster and have like 10 times the capacity, and we could do key-based exploration, we could really push development teams to cache much more, but then they still have to deal with knowing when something's invalid. So yeah, the other ones are mostly manual stuff, whereas the caching one I think has the most interesting sort of layer on top that we can do. Sidekick has headroom, but it's also a bit worrying because we can't, like, splitting it is going to take a long time. Like, we can't functionally partition it in the same way. Can we? Sorry, I just remembered something we talked about when we were doing the zonal clusters planning. Because we talked about, where's the epic for that? We talked about there were some things that we could actually move out of there and into persistent. Yes, there's a couple of things we could move out. Sorry, let me link to that epic. Now, none of those sound very big, but sidekick status, I'm actually looking at an issue for that, which is different, just to make sidekick status be used a lot less. And let me find that same issue as well. So sidekick status is a middleware that performs a Redis write every time we push a job, Redis set every time we push a job. But the vast majority of jobs don't actually ever read for the vast majority of jobs, sorry, we don't ever actually read that value. Like we know up front which jobs we're going to read that value for. And while set shouldn't be expensive, it is actually the most common command that we run on Redis Sidekick, I think. I mean, it's pretty close, but it's up there. So that is something that could be functionally partitioned out of there, but we will run out of things that we can do that with very quickly. But we do have a list of things that we can do that with, is what I'm trying to say. So yeah, just to go back to what you're, sorry, go on, Igor.
This might be opening up a can of worms, but have we considered also the possibility of moving individual sidekick queues to dedicated instances?
No, we didn't.
That is something that I have done at a previous job for reliability or isolation purposes. So I don't know what the scaling characteristics of that are, but just wanted to kind of raise it.
Yeah, that's interesting. So in theory, I think that's doable. There are some issues, obviously, because it's not going to be straightforward, but I think they're largely around our like how we choose to do things. So like how we route jobs to queues happens at the point where a job is scheduled, essentially. So that's the point where we need to know which Redis it goes to. But if we're talking about a Redis per queue or per shard, I guess, there's only a very limited number of shards. So that's sort of tractable. It's not like we've got 100 shards. That's an interesting idea. We should explore that further. At least create an issue for it and like explore that further is what I mean. Like I think that's a good shout.
I think that's it's sort of similar to the zonal clusters. I mean, in the sense yes. we're talking about splitting up the Sidekick workload into multiple discrete units. Zonal clusters is one way, per shard or for specific queues is another. There's probably a few other arbitrary ways we can do it.
Yeah, so the distinction with zonal clusters is that this has limited headroom in the sense that, like, if we split out catch-all, well, I guess we can split out catch-all again, but there's diminishing returns, whereas with what we're calling zonal, I don't really feel like zonal clusters is the right name, but just sharding.
I want to say shard.
Yeah. We already use shard for something else, but sharding.
I mean, it's to me that is the concept that I'm using is more load balancing, because
Yeah.
we've got copies of the same queue on multiple Redises, and the clients are choosing through some mechanism which one to send it to. And that could be zonal affinity, that could be round robin. It doesn't really matter that much. But the point is really we're load balancing that across multiple Redises as opposed to directing it to a specific one, right?
Yes, with the zonal clusters, the clients wouldn't be choosing. Like each client would only know about their own zonal one. But yeah, the basic idea is right. Yes. So I think the advantage potentially of doing it by queue is that we get to sidestep some of the potential issues we had with zonal clusters, because if we know what queue a job should be in, which we do, then we know which Redis it will be on. Whereas and by nature of doing it by queue, all application instances have to know about all Redises, whereas the point of zonal clusters is you should only know about your own Redis, but then how do you get the overview? So that's the distinction I see. And technically, we don't have to do zonal clusters that way. We could do zonal clusters so that all can see all, but then we lose some of the conceptual simplicity, at least.
Yeah, the round robin way is functionally pretty. I mean, in terms of scalability, pretty similar. So there's some subtleties in the functionality. You still need that regional overview one, and some queues just going to have to go on a regional, a global sidekick, which I think we were going to have anyway.
Yes.
Okay. I mean, I think we can look at those at the Redis per shard and what we're calling zonal clusters as two variants of more or less the same idea. It's still, in either case, we're provisioning multiple sort of traditional Redises, if you want to call them that, like Sentinel-based ones.
Yep.
And so at least from the infrastructure side, there's no huge difference between the two.
Yeah, and to go back to Craig's point at the start, it doesn't matter if they're in Kubernetes or they can be on Kubernetes or in VMs, and there will be trade-offs between those two, but fundamentally, we can do it with either.
The app doesn't care at all.
Yeah, the app side doesn't care. There will be benefits to potentially doing it one way or the other, but that mostly depends on what we've done with the other stuff. But yeah.
Okay, so maybe coming back to your initial question, Craig, does it make sense to do both being Redis on Kubernetes and some form of scaling, be that Redis cluster or be that scaling out, say, Redis Sidekick?
It comes down to migrations. In my mind, is that if we move to Redis cluster, we're going to have to migrate that for any one of these things. We're going to have to migrate from standalone Redis to Redis cluster. That's a data migration of whatever complexity it is for the particular instance we're talking about. And then moving into Kubernetes, if we migrate to Redis cluster on VMs, we've done have to do some sort of migration, which could be a week of effort. And then if we move to Redis cluster in Kubernetes, we've got to migrate from Redis cluster outside to Redis cluster inside Kubernetes, probably, unless we did some sort of cross thingy, add nodes inside Kubernetes into a Redis cluster, and then just drop them out of the.
I mean, ideally, yes, and the same for Sentinel-based setups, right? I definitely
just do a replication and then failover.
Yeah, I'd aim to do something like that. There's probably some tricky bits there as well. In particular, the Sentinels, I think, will be tricky because the clients need to know about them, and that might not be super straightforward, but
it would be easier with the way you're headed away from operators, because an operator wants to know everything. Whereas if we're using Helm charts, we can bodge to, I mean, we could, for transitional purposes, be sort of a little bit manipulative. Yeah, we can do what we want with the YAML. I mean, ultimately, we can lie to it as much as we like. It's just it'll be not even the network. Network's not even too hard. Just IP addresses. Yeah. In which case, the migration into Kubernetes is it's fiddly, but it's not as hard as I thought. It's not a data migration the EF has to care about. It's not something where we have to think about expirations and multiple Redises that it knows about. Yeah, all the complexity of that and feature flags and things. So we can treat this at an infrastructure level. So that means that we could de-risk it by running cluster outside of Kubernetes to start with, if we wanted to. There's that talk of, I think you mentioned it, Igor, someone mentioned it, the idea of moving from VMs, traditional Redis, directly to a cluster in Kubernetes is there's two orthogonal changes at once, and oh my goodness, yeah, terrifying. You wouldn't do that for your very first migration to something in Kubernetes. That's just asking for not knowing what's wrong when something goes wrong. So I don't know what I'm trying to conclude here.
I guess you're trying to say, which do we do first, right? Do we move to Kubernetes first, or do we move to cluster first?
Moving traditional Redis to Kubernetes in one go seems fine, because that we're changing one thing, changing the deployment method, and we can understand it. We can do that with something trivial. I mean, we could do that with something like rate limiting, because the migration of data is, we've got options in terms of migration of data.
The nice thing about rate limiting is we don't need to care about it, which also means it's a great candidate for like trying out some things on like this.
I mean, that gives us, that gives us a trivial migration, and all we're focusing on is is this Redis in Kubernetes sensible? Is it working? Is it doing what we want? Can we operate it? And the risk is so small.
And then we also see how much, like we're saying that moving into Kubernetes gives us the benefit from an operability perspective. And if we do it for one of them, we'll be able to see that for ourselves of how much benefit it gives. And then we may be able to take that further and say, yes, for cluster, this will be amazing, and we should do this, and we should migrate it in this order. Or we might say, the operability is actually so much that we need to understand more about how this works before scheduling the migration into Kubernetes. So we'll go to cluster first and then to Kubernetes. That it seems like taking the easy ones there first gives us the data to make the choice of which way around we will go.
Yeah. And everyone we migrate, every time, I mean, when we've been running, let's say we did rate limiting first, and 2 weeks later, we've got all that, just that sustained confidence that it works. I mean, sometimes it's just time of this has been running for X amount of time and nothing has broken.
Yeah,
that's what we're looking for. We're looking for that baseline, this works kind of thing.
The other thing with cluster that sort of, I don't know if it complicates things, is if we are going to use Redis cluster, the earlier we start using Redis cluster, the better, because then we will shake out any incompatibilities in our application. Like, ideally, we wouldn't want to have any, but if we do have them, we want to know sooner. And the sooner we start using Redis cluster, the sooner we will find them. I don't think it's likely that we add new ones now, though. So I don't think that's a huge deal, but it's just like always a possibility that we add something that makes it completely impossible for us to move to Redis cluster, because it's like a key part of the app that we then have to like functionally partition out again of whatever instance we were moving to Redis cluster. Whereas if we were already on Redis cluster, it could never be built in a way that was incompatible in the first place. But I don't think that's a huge concern, because I don't think any of these actually need to be on Redis cluster anytime soon. From what I see.
I mean, we also do have some safeguards in the app, right?
Yes, we do. Yeah. And that's why I think it's unlikely that we'll build new things that disregard those. That turn out to be critical. I think it's unlikely that we build new critical functionality that works in a way like that. Anyway, I think GitLab is at the point where we are adding we're still adding plenty of stuff, but we're not building new critical functionality necessarily all the time. So yeah.
There's also if we want to gain more confidence ahead of time, there's also a PCAP based script to validate the traffic as well ahead of time. So we can take a sample of production traffic, look at whether the access patterns would be incompatible with Redis cluster. So on the confidence side, that could help as well.
Yes, no, that sounds very useful. We would certainly want to do that. Yes.
But what you seem to be saying, and I think I agree with you at the moment, is that cluster is, again, no, you're saying both.
I'm saying it seems unnecessary, but also,
yeah.
If we
also the sooner we do it, the better. Yeah.
Yeah, if we can do it with relatively low effort, we probably should. But it's clearly not the top priority. Like I don't think anybody on this call thinks moving any instance to Redis cluster is like key, even in the next year.
I'd say a year seems about right. We're going to be back to functional partitioning again in a year. I mean, and we still have some options, but I have two competing things here. One is the operational risk of moving to cluster because it's new, it's different. There's you just don't know what's going to go wrong. The other one is I don't want to keep having these conversations. I want to put cluster in. I want to work on something
that's not Redis for a while.
I want to put cluster in. I want to scale my cache cluster to 10 Redises and not care.
Exactly. That's what I was saying, especially at the start about cache, right? Like that's the one where like I feel like that's the one where we could get to a point where we literally don't. Well, that's probably a pipe dream, but we really don't feel like we should have to care about that at all. In the same way as we do the other ones.
So if there are two candidates, am I correct in thinking that there are two candidates for cluster, cache and persistent?
Yes, I think technically we can move trace chunks and possibly rate limiting, but
those are just the plain non-cluster versions. We just moving those as
sessions.
Well, eventually. Sessions I'm not sure about because we might have some cross-slot operations, but we could do it eventually. That would just potentially take more time.
So I'm trying to. So the ones that are traditional, like normal Redis instances that will just move as is without attempting cluster or doing anything special. Those are rate limiting and trace chunks. The ones that we're considering cluster for are cache and persistent.
Yes, but we could also put cluster on rate limiting again as a test bed. Because
it's massive overkill.
Yeah, exactly. Like it's kind of a waste of money.
What I was trying to get to is there was one of the concerns earlier was, do you go to cluster and then go to Kubernetes, or do you do both at the same time? And I think again, to de-risk it, you go to cluster first and then you go to Kubernetes, and then you decide based on the data you get from that experiment if you're going to do that in the same way with the second instance, or if you can do both steps in one go for the second.
I think that's definitely a Craig and Igor question.
Yeah, I'm kind of two minds on this one because the risk of doing it with VMs is that we end up doing the work twice. Because I do think they're pretty different environments and different deployment models. And there's so much that we've already figured out on how to operate our Sentinel-based setup. Like there's a lot of custom in-house logic for that. And I'm kind of worried that we'll end up having to do something similar with cluster as well, which fingers crossed, but like 90% of that might be covered by whatever the Redis in Kubernetes solution has built in.
I agree with you on that, and it's that duplicative effort of running cluster on VMs first. And you know what Chef's like, and every time anyone touches a Chef recipe or tries to create a new Chef recipe, I mean, you watch Infrastructure Lounge blow up with people complaining about that and starting from scratch. And
you got the Chef incident the other week, so
yeah. Given that Redis cluster is not a completely different bit of software, I mean, it is still just Redis run with some different options.
That is from Redis Labs.
Yeah, it's literally the same binary with different
Yeah.
options. I mean, we're not talking about something that you deploy completely. Right? It's Sentinel versus not Sentinel. It does its own thing, but it's still the same code base, same thing. I'm beginning to come to the conclusion that it would be reasonable to start with a traditional Redis in Kubernetes for something like rate limiting, to gain running the Redis Labs binary in Kubernetes with however we do that, and to then, once we've got that confidence, to run Redis cluster in Kubernetes and migrate something to that, so say cache to that. That feels like a reasonable mitigation of sort of that middle path of mitigating the various risks in a way that I would feel comfortable as an operations person saying, yeah, we've done this.
Yeah, Igor, one thing that struck me when you were talking is that it almost sounds like if we move to Redis cluster on VMs, that makes potentially moving to Kubernetes much harder. Like potentially the work is bigger in total if we go Redis Sentinel on VMs, Redis cluster on VMs, Redis cluster on Kubernetes, as opposed to if we go to Kubernetes and then to cluster, because when we move to cluster, we'll be adding more Chef stuff, which we then have to port. So I don't know.
There's an additional migration that we need to do if we do it that way.
Mm-hmm.
One thing that just came to mind though, which I don't know if this is a major concern or not, but a benefit of running it on VMs first is we get to compare.
Yep.
And that to me would be quite a big value add.
So we get to compare what?
Compare performance of Redis running on VMs versus running on Kubernetes. So I don't know if that's something we absolutely need, but yeah, we will be able
to see it for traditional first, and I think I don't know
how big would the difference have to be for us to decide to not run it on Kubernetes? So for example, we spin up a VM instance Redis cluster. We spin up the Kubernetes instance Redis cluster. There's some kind of performance difference. Like how big is that realistically have to be for us to decide that we will never go to Kubernetes with this?
Well, I think Sidekick again is the one there where I would be a little bit worried because we're on I think for all Redises, we're on the biggest C2 in terms of compute that we can have.
Not exactly. I mean, it's all about this. It's the CPU that matters.
Yeah,
that's the single CPU. The C2 is the C2 class
CPU in terms of single core CPU. Sorry. So I think the ones that are at risk of CPU saturation are the ones where we need to care about that. The ones like rate limiting, where it's a 40% CPU saturation. If moving it onto Kubernetes took that up to 50%. We would be fine with that. If moving it, Sidekick took it from 70%, 75% to 85%, that would be bad.
Yeah, I mean, there's been a few cases of overhead introduced by containerization or like network overhead. So I'd at least like to know, right? That's the worry that I have isn't so much that it's going to be too high and then we can't migrate. It's rather that we are paying a huge performance cost and we don't even know about it. And there might be some configuration that could help mitigate that as well.
Yeah, and we'd lose some headroom. Isn't another way of thinking about it, right? Like, it will take X months to saturation and it will take less than X months if we're on Kubernetes because we have the additional overhead.
But we're wanting to move, we're talking about Redis cluster. The worry about that is Redis cluster rather than Redis traditional, because the Redis traditional we're going to move are the ones that are already low enough that we right now the trash out, so that's cool. We're not worried about the CPU on those. Redis cluster, I mean, in theory, is scale sideways. So to answer Rachel's question, it would have to be something like 50% drop or something. And even then, it's Redis cluster. We throw another resource at it.
Yeah, we just spend more money.
But
I
this
mean,
is also
you-
probably a reason for me to keep going with my load testing stuff so that we could actually run that,
Yeah.
run production load testing stuff against the Kubernetes.
Yeah,
The
and
more I
Redis.
think about this,
and
the
I
more I
mean,
think.
And
Sorry,
I
go
mean,
on.
you know me, I always want more data to make more decisions. I think what I'm trying to figure out is how much data is necessary to inform the choice. Yeah, that's the reason for asking. Sorry, Sean, I interrupted you.
Yeah, the more I think about it, the more I think we should just almost not be talking about Redis Sidekick in these conversations because it's so different in terms of like its usage patterns and in terms of what we can do with it. Like if we were going to do something massive to Sidekick, I'm not saying that zonal clusters or queue-based sharding would be that, but if we were going to do something bigger than that, we would also be basically at the point of considering not using Redis as the store for Sidekick, which would be a different question entirely. Whereas we're pretty much going to stay with Redis for everything else, I think. So then the other thing with Sidekick is especially that who knows what's going on with pods. Keep an eye on the channel, but like the idea with pods is that we have isolated GitLab application instances with their own databases that somehow federate. I think I haven't fully caught up with the latest slides. But if we do that, we already have to have isolated Redis sidekicks, and then this problem kind of goes away for us because, I say this problem goes away from us. Clearly, it's more complicated to build pods than it is to do separate Redis sidekicks. So on a global level, that's not really an argument for doing it, but just specifically for us, that question does kind of go away. And it would go away for the other Redises as well, but we already have other basically Sidekick's the one where we have the fewest options. The other ones, I think we have plenty of options. It's just about choosing what to do.
Okay, well, let's focus then on the choosing what to do part, because I think we're all in agreement that moving the traditional instances to Kubernetes is the first step. That seems totally obvious. And I think, Sean, what you're saying is we should take Redis Sidekick out of the conversation for now, because there'll be, as you say, there's very few options of what we can do. I think we're going to land up gathering good data from the rest of the things that we perform as to what other options are available to us for Redis Sidekick. But that doesn't mean that we should rule out doing something in parallel to this effort. It may be that we have to do something to Redis Sidekick sooner than we hope, and so we do it in parallel. But what is the step after doing the traditional Redis instances? Are we going to run one of the clusters in a VM, or are we going to go take the instance to Kubernetes and then switch and then put the cluster pod on?
I think by that stage, as slightly terrifying as it is that we just move to Redis cluster in Kubernetes for that one, because we already know how to run Redis in Kubernetes at that stage. I think with some load testing and all.
Is that with Craig?
So I mean, we rate limiting into trash chunks first for traditional. Well, it's either cache or persistent. Probably cache would be my gut feel, but I wouldn't pin myself to that particularly hard.
No, I think that's the one where it makes the most sense, and it's also the one of that and persistent where we can tolerate a bit more bumpiness.
Yeah.
Right, it's the one with less risk. Yeah.
And also scale. I mean, Redis persistent technically, I mean, because of the data we're storing there has more functional partitioning capability. Redis cache is a lot harder to, I mean, we've pulled out rate limiting already. I'm not sure there's much else we can trivially pull out of that without monkeying deep in the guts of Rails.
No,
I mean, I think it might be doable if we have to, but the question is, do we want to?
Well,
and
yeah,
cache,
exactly, because you would use Redis cluster for this as your obvious choice, right?
Cache with lots of keys screams cluster. I mean, this is just the obvious candidate next.
Yep.
Yeah. So
Okay, so for that one, what order are we going to do it?
Move first, move from VM to Kubernetes as a traditional or Sentinel-based setup. And then inside Kubernetes, migrate from Sentinel to cluster.
You're saying do that for cache?
Yes.
Right.
I think that's what you were saying, Craig, right?
No, I was saying do one step straight from VM.
Do both at the same time.
Traditional VM for Redis cache, traditional VM to Redis cluster Kubernetes in one go.
Okay.
Because by that stage we will have already known how these things run. I know it sounds risky, but it's kind of like painful otherwise.
Yeah, it's worth evaluating.
Yeah, I think
how comfortable we feel at that point.
Yeah, I think it's worth saying that's our initial plan, and if we get to the point where we're doing it and we change our mind, we'll have a better idea at that point. So Rachel, just to go back to what you were just saying, so basically what I got from that is we are essentially ignoring Redis Sidekick for now unless it becomes a problem again. Is that right? I'm happy with that, just to be clear. I just want to understand that that's the case, whereas the other ones we're doing something proactively with, even though it's not a problem, because we can do them first, because they are more tractable.
Yeah, so that's right. I'm recommending that we take Redis Sidekick out of the conversation entirely, but we continue to monitor it as we currently do. And if something in the monitoring says to us, we need to act, then we figure out how to act and we act. But
same as any other service, really.
Yeah, I feel like we've got a load of different things to try and concentrate on, and we need to focus the concentration onto specific things that we can do. And we could do that either onto Redis Sidekick or onto practically everything else. And so I'm voting for the practically everything else bucket for now.
Sean, would that also mean that you continue working with Heinrich to do whatever you guys are doing with all those little wee things to just gain ourselves, 5% here, 5% there?
Yes, although I realized I was doing all this experimentation, and basically all of my experiments last week were invalid. It's basically what happened. But now I have valid experiments. I have what now seems like an obvious solution, obvious answer, which is that actually reducing the frequency of pollers doesn't help much, because most of the pollers are actually doing something, and it's the doing something that's causing the Redis CPU issues. And so we have to pop the same amount of jobs off the queue and off the scheduled set and into the queue. It doesn't really matter how many processes are doing that. That's not actually contributing much to Redis CPU usage. It's the number of scheduled jobs that's doing it. So unfortunately, that's not very good news, but on the plus side, I got an actual result, which was better.
Cool. But you're doing that. You said there was a few other little things as well. And I mean,
yes,
I assume those things, you'll be ticking those things over quietly over time.
Yeah, I'll be doing the one that seems like it could have the most impact and seeing what that does, and then go from there. But yeah, basically until we've got another project to work on, that's what I'm working on as
I'm just thinking that work quietly in the background might be enough to sort of offset natural growth for a while. It gives us those sort of more months headroom down the line.
Yeah, that's the aim. It's just to sort of shave away that increase, like you said, like just to keep us on an even keel, I guess. So yeah.
Yeah, and if you're doing that as well, then I'm also okay with leaving Sidekick just on the back burner for now. It's we know it's a problem. It's been a problem for the last 18 months, 2 years. It's going to continue to be a problem forever.
Yes.
So then last instance to ask about, and I know it's not even an instance yet, but Redis sessions. So we'll decide at the point at which it goes into production, we'll then make the decision of where in this list it goes.
Technically, we could put that into Kubernetes first. But I think it makes more sense to just do the migration in the order we planned. But technically, we could just start with it in Kubernetes because it doesn't exist. But yeah, I think
I'd rather put it in the queue.
Yeah, same. I think that's way too much risk to answer that.
Yeah. I mean, we can certainly tolerate losing that data, but it's still a pretty bad experience for the users.
Oh man, support would not be happy with us.
Okay, so I've put a provisional list here. 1, migrate the traditional Redis instances to Kubernetes. 2, Redis cache, put it into Kubernetes and cluster in one go, but we'll evaluate and determine if that's wise. 3, we'll do Redis sessions. And then 4, we'll do Redis persistent.
Yeah, that works for me.
Okay.
How about OKR
yeah.
scope?
Yeah, well, this I was going to ask. We also are sharing this with delivery, so it makes sense for the migration of the traditional ones to potentially go to delivery, because there's the most. It's a very constrained scope. Lift it, put it in Kubernetes, done. I mean, in comparison to cluster and all the other pieces.
But do we want
to?
Do we want to be involved in that so we have more experience when it comes to doing the Redis cluster stuff, the double?
I think we should, because there's going to have to be an exchange of information, and it's easier to just be involved in the process than to try and have it so then try to just have it handed back or handed off to us after the fact. So I think we'll need to go to them and say, this is the plan, like this is the order that we want to do things in. How can we work together to get it done? Like, what do they recommend in terms of how to work with them? And then perhaps we can just be flexible in terms of, maybe it's even putting 2 people together from each of the teams to say, you 4 go together and figure out all of these pieces.
So I do think there is quite a bit of sort of front-loaded work that we need to do to really get Redis and Kubernetes into a production-ready state. So all I'm saying is we shouldn't underestimate that work. I think it's probably going to take us, maybe a month or 2 to really get to a point where we feel confident that this is something that we can actually run.
So do you think that front-loaded work is a good idea, that we pair right from now with someone on delivery? Because then the information is shared from right now rather than us learning everything and handing over. So then I'll go to Amy and I'll find someone that we can pair with.
Excellent.
They got a new SRE? Didn't they get a new SRE like last week?
Don't remember.
They did. They also have Henry, who is in the same country as Igor. Same city? No, same country though.
Close, almost, yeah.
So we've got memory team working for us on sessions. We've got delivery helping us with this.
Meanwhile, the different Scalability is working on the Gitly stuff.
Well, we're finally scaling the scalability work, right?
Okay, last question. What is the OKR? Everything except Sidekick?
Based on what Igor said, I would be tempted to say we just have rate limiting and trace chunks. It sounds like trace chunks will be the second of those, it sounds like should be fairly straightforward. It's the first one because all the work's so heavily front loaded. But then because we're talking about the end goal for cache being Kubernetes and Redis cluster, that could easily slip. That could be an OKR in itself, almost, like potentially, depending on how it goes. So I would be tempted to cap it at basically A from your points in plan of work.
I know exactly what Maren is going to say, which is, why can't we do the next piece as well? So what about at least a plan for the next set, for the next piece?
How about we know something about knowing how to run Redis cluster in Kubernetes? Yeah, that we've got that somewhere, even not deployed. It feels like a separate line item though. It's on the same train, but it's kind of distinct.
Well, that's true as well. Like the first 2 items, A and B, are kind of 2 separate things.
Yeah, so I guess evaluation of Redis cluster in Kubernetes could be kind of a prep step for Redis cache. And what I'll also point out here is that a lot of the work that we will be doing for Redis traditional in Kubernetes, a lot of that can be reused once we do Redis cluster. It's like both of those have a large overlapping set of stuff that we need to figure out. And, you know, once we've got it figured out, at least all of that stuff won't be needed for when we do Redis cluster with cache.
It's very incremental. Yeah, it's the same. It's the same binary with a few different options. I mean, I know I'm trivializing it, but I mean, it's not a million. Yeah, it's not a completely different system.
Right. Like, I'd say most of the backup stuff, all of the observability stuff is going to carry over directly or translate directly. So yeah, I'd say this the work that we're doing here is very much also in support of Redis cluster. Just in case that framing might help you as well, Rachel.
Yeah, it definitely does. The way I'm visualizing it is like there are two separate paths, but they both start on exactly the same thing. They're both using exactly the same base to build, and then the other one advances as you include the cluster pod.
Yep.
Okay.
I mean, we could also put Redis sessions above Redis cache and just say we'll try and move that as well, but I think that's less interesting and less useful. It's just simpler to say.
I think also Redis sessions is going to depend on what the project looks like when it's finished and what we observe about that instance when it's running.
That's true. We have no idea. Like,
Yeah,
well, I say we have no idea. We have some idea, but we don't know for sure what
we just don't have a clear idea.
That instance performs like.
Yeah, and I think we should leave Redis sessions running in production for, we should specify a number of weeks and say after this many weeks, we make the plan as to what we're going to do to it. But I think this is a reasonable start. I mean, we aren't running Redis in Kubernetes anyway. We've got to figure out how to do that. We want to make sure that when we move it into Kubernetes, we do it properly, not just sort of throw it at Kubernetes and we'll deal with observability later and we'll deal with all this other stuff later. Like, let's move it and move it nicely now. And part of this moving over is also making sure that the reliability teams understand how to operate it. So it looks like it's a small like line item of just move rate limiting and trace chunks, but it's the first one. Let's make it work properly and let's make sure that other people can operate it successfully. So I'm happy to take those two as the OKR, and we can go for that.
I feel comfortable with that scope.
This feels good. I feel really good about this. Also, side note, Redis sessions, once we know what it looks like, we could also decide whether it's traditional Redis or cluster in Kubernetes when we get to that point. Probably traditional, but I mean, it's not ruled out the case that we might actually get to that point and say, well, this needs to be big.
Yeah. Awesome. This has been a successful meeting. Anything else you want to talk about or go through before we sign off? Okay, I will upload this video. I will put the notes from this into an issue somewhere. I've got a bunch of actions to take from this, and I'll leave you all to carry on with things. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, guys. Bye.
Bye.